Welcome to another great episode here on IT Pro TV. Today we're taking a look at the new 2016 PMP exam update. And here to help us out, Mr. Don Pezet. How's it going, Don?
It is going great, Ronnie. Thanks for having me on the show. We wanted to take some time. This is kind of off the beaten path, right? Normally our episodes focus on the exam objectives and we want to go through and make sure everybody understands those so you can be prepared. Well, in this one, we're actually going to focus on the objectives themselves. As many of you guys have heard, there's a new exam update rolling out from the PMI that takes effect January 11th, I think it's January 11th, 2016. It's definitely January of 2016. And it's got a lot of people concerned, right? And it's one of those things where if you've been studying and getting ready for the exam and all of a sudden they announce a new change that's coming down the road, what do we do? How does that affect us? And for those of you who are watching this episode before January 11, 2016, then you know you've got this impending deadline. But even for people who are watching this after January 11, 2016, it's still important. And let me tell you why. The big challenge when an exam update happens is that there are a lot of books that are out there. There's a lot of videos that are out there. There's a lot of classroom training that's out there that's all based on the exam. And when the exam changes, there's always a good period of 6 months to even a year in some cases where you're just not certain, is the training content I'm getting updated for the new exam, right? Well, fortunately in this case, this type of exam update is a little different than what most of us are used to, and it means that the majority of the training that you're already using is going to be just fine, all right? And let me explain why that is. When PMI, the Project Management Institute, when they update their exam, there's two different times they update the exam, all right? The main one, the one that we normally watch out for, is when they update the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge, right? That's that big book that has all the various processes and process groups that we can use to manage a project, right? All the tools and techniques and all that good stuff bundled into one big book, and it's what most of the exam is based on. So obviously, anytime the PMBOK updates, we need to go back and update the exam, right? And the exam changes to reflect what's new in the PMBOK. Now, fortunately, the PMBOK only changes so much, right? They usually only change it about every 6 years, right? So 5 to 6 years is usually when you see an update on that. It can be as short as 3 years, though. That has happened, but it's normally a little bit longer, normally 5 to 6 years. And when it does change, it's pretty rare that it's a drastic change. It does happen. Like I remember when 3rd edition came out. 5th edition is current right now, just in case you don't know. You probably should know. But when 3rd edition came out, I remember how challenging it was because all the earned value analysis stuff, they changed. Because you used to have the BCWP and all those other ones that were, the 4-letter acronyms, and they switched to all the 2-letter and 3-letter acronyms. And so you had to relearn all these acronyms, but the formulas were the same. The data you were calculating was the same. It was just different terms. But when the 4th edition came out and the 5th edition came out, they were really just minor changes. A few new processes came in, a few old processes went out, and that was it. It wasn't that drastic, but your study content had to be updated, all right? So that's one example of when the exam updates, and that's not what's happening this time, okay? This time, the PMBOK is staying the same. PMBOK 5th edition is current. They're working on the 6th edition. 6th edition is coming down the line, but it'll probably be 2017 before we see the 6th edition of the PMBOK. But right now we're on the 5th. The exam is going to update in January 2016, and it's still based on the 5th. So the PMBOK isn't changing. And that means that if you have study materials like our show here on IT Pro TV, we based our show off of the PMBOK, not off of the exam, because you're not allowed to do that, because you're not allowed to share content from the exam. So that means that since the PMBOK doesn't change, the content doesn't change, right? So if the PMBOK didn't change, what did change? Well, every 3 to 5 years, usually it's closer to 3 years than 5 years, but every 3 to 5 years, the PMI does what's called an RDS, okay? It's a role delineation survey. If you're a member of the PMI, most of you are, I know I encourage everybody to join the PMI, if for no other reason than the exam discount you get, which effectively pays for the membership, but you get a free copy of the PMBOK. You get all sorts of great resources, so I encourage you to join the PMI. If you're a member, though, then you'll know every 3 to 5 years you get an email, you get invited to this survey, and basically you get to tell the PMI what real life is like for you, right? As a project manager, and Ronnie, you know this, we read one thing in the book, but then in real life things are a little different, right? So the PMI is always trying to keep up to date on that. And that's what they do with these RDSs, the Role Delineation Survey. They reach out to project managers and they say, what's your role in the company? What is it that you find yourself doing day after day? And they structure the exam to match what real life project management professionals are doing. Remember, you've got to have 5 years of experience being an actual project manager just to take the exam. So they want to make sure the exam is based on that experience. And it changes, right? The role of project manager has been around for thousands of years, and it's changed a lot in that time. And so that's what PMI is doing, is updating the exam to reflect that role. Still based on PMBOK version 5, or the 5th edition of the PMBOK, but our role is different. And so what that means is they change where they put the weight of the exam. All right, now let me show you what I mean on that, because it gets a little confusing. So I've got pulled up the official exam content outline, right? So this is from PMI. And on the left, I've got the old outline. This is the one that was posted in 2011. And as of this taping, this is what's current. So this is what you would see on the exam if you took it today. But if you're watching this video on January 11, 2016 or later, or you're just getting ready for it, this is the new outline, okay? And notice how we still have the same 5 phases, right? We've got initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing, right? And if we look at the percentages, they've changed a little. See how they took closing and they reduced it down to 7%? And then they took our executing and bumped it up to 31%, right? They've changed the weights. And the reason they did that is they found that as a project manager, you spend more of your time managing execution than you do closing, right? So they've started to reduce the importance of that. And that's the real impact that we have. The content you study isn't different. The amount of questions that you get is going to be different. We're going to get more questions on executing and less questions on closing. That's the biggest difference. Now, there's a few other differences. So, for example, they have actually added some stuff to the exam objectives. I'll show you guys that here in just a moment. They've taken away some things from the exam objectives, things that people really weren't using. They were either redundant or inconsequential, so they pulled them out. They put in new things that project managers were finding themselves doing, and they added to it. So there's that, all right? And they're also updating the question pool. Now, when you take the PMP exam, you get 200 questions. You get a lot of questions. But it's actually being drawn from a pool of somewhere between 400 and 600 questions. So in theory, I could take the exam, and Ronnie could take the exam on the same day, and we could have 200 completely different questions, right? But statistically, that's not likely, right? The odds are we're going to have quite a few questions in common. And if I don't pass the exam, I could always go and take it again a few days later. And when I take it again, I'm going to see some of the same questions again. Statistically, that's going to happen. You're going to see some of the same questions again. Well, when the January 11 update rolls out, about 25% of the questions will be adjusted to reflect the new objectives. Another 25% of the questions will be all new ones based on the existing objectives, and then the remaining 50% will actually stay the same from before. That means 50% of the question pool will be brand new. So if you take the exam on January 10th and then take it again on January 17th, right? There's 50% of the questions that are all new, and so you're statistically far less likely to see duplicate questions, right? So it's a new question pool. Now, how does it impact most of you? It doesn't, all right? Who does it impact? It impacts cheaters. There are cheaters out there. There's people that find ways to get exam questions. Well, they're all new exam questions, or at least half the pool is going to be different starting on January 11th. And so it helps to kind of curb cheating, as well as get the questions phrased in a way that's a little more up to date, right? You guys know how that is, right? Changing terminology, changing acronyms, things start to get a little dated. And when you've got exam questions that are referencing MySpace, that might have made sense 5 years ago, but today people are like, well, what is MySpace? I think Justin Timberlake told me about that or something, but now you might want to change it to reference Facebook or something else. So that's the kind of stuff that you'll see. So that's the big deal there. So if you've been studying and preparing, don't panic. The materials you're already using are more than likely just fine, assuming they were good materials in the first place, right? If they were bad materials before, they're going to be bad now too. But if they were good materials before, they're still going to be good. They're going to cover what you need, unless they were really strictly based on the exam objectives. All right, now, most people never actually look at the true exam objectives, which is kind of funny, but let me show you what I mean when I say the actual exam objectives. if I take a look at the new outline here, right? So this is the new outline, and if you drill down into it, basically what they do is when they present the exam objectives to you, they don't present it in terms of process groups. They don't present it in terms of here's a particular process you need to know. They present it to you in terms of tasks. These are tasks that a normal project manager is expected to do. So as a project manager, when you're in the initiating phase, right, where 13% of our questions come from, you're expected to perform project assessment based on available information, lessons learned, and so on, right? We're expected to know how to manage a project is effectively what this task is saying, all right? And that hasn't changed, right? These are the new objectives. Let me switch back over to the old objectives. And if we look at the old objectives, you'll actually see that they've basically got that same statement. I believe it's word for word. I don't think that one's changed at all. Actually, it looks like some word is different. They subtly change little words every now and then. That doesn't really matter. But perform project assessment, that's really not any different than what we had before. Okay, so what is different? Well, they've added some new things. And here on initiation, they've actually added 3 new tasks. Okay, now if I look at the old objectives, I can see there were 6 tasks on initiation. Now there's 8. I said they added 3. What does that mean? Well, PMI is being really good about telling everybody what they've added. They're not really telling people what they took away. So I want to make sure I show you guys that so you're aware. They added identifying key deliverables based on business requirements. Now, you might ask yourself, wait a minute, Don, we identified key deliverables before. Why is this now a task right here? Okay, well, what's going on is that PMI is recognizing a shift that's happening. In the past, project managers didn't really get involved in initiating. What would happen is a project would initiate because some executive, some department head or vice president or CEO or whatever would decide that a project was worth undertaking, or a PMO for that matter would decide a project was worth undertaking. And after they had the charter signed and everything was done, they'd move into the planning phase, and that's when they would attach a project manager. So it was very possible that as a PM, you weren't involved in initiating at all. Well, after the RDS that was undertaken earlier this year, the PMI found that project managers are increasingly getting involved in initiating. So they needed to strengthen that up a little more and increase the project manager's influence there. Now, the project manager does have some limited influence, but one of the things that's really important is we don't just need to identify the key deliverables. That was something we were doing before, right, as we built our scope. But we need to do it based on the business requirements, all right? That's the key phrase that we need to remember there, is that when we undertake a project, as a project manager, it's our responsibility to make sure that this project is actually helping the company. And so you're going to see an increased stress on a cost to benefit analysis, right? Are we actually making the company better by undertaking this project, or are we hurting the company? All right. And in the past, because initiating was already done and it was already handed off to us, we just got involved in the planning, those decisions were already made. But PMI found that that's just not the case, right? That project managers do get involved in that. And so that's now part of the exam. So that's kind of what they're stressing there, right? After that, we see other things that we've been doing. Perform stakeholder analysis, right? We've got a whole process for that. Identify high-level risks. Now, it's not talking about doing full risk analysis here. It's saying high level, right? What is kind of the common sense? What do we know is going to be a risk that's out there? Participate in the development of the project charter. Now, that one was actually present in the old objectives too. You'll see it right here. Develop the project charter. And what PMI found was that that's not realistic. That very few project managers are actually drafting their own charter. That if you're being assigned in the planning phase, you don't necessarily draft it, but you participate in the development of it. That whoever the sponsor is, they're normally the ones who are drafting that charter, and we just assist with that if we're involved at all. So they just changed the wording a little bit there. All right. Obtain project charter approval. That one's been there always, because you've got to have approval. You've got to get your authority from somewhere. And then here's the 2 new ones. Conduct a benefit analysis with the relevant stakeholders. Again, is this project going to benefit the company, or should we kill it off right now and not move forward? Well, if you've already watched our shows, you know we covered that whole benefit analysis, looking at that to see if it was necessary. It's always been there. It's always been in the PMBOK. But it wasn't called out in the exam objectives because it wasn't stressed as something a project manager needed to do. It's kind of like the whole accounting side. When you go into the budgeting of the PMBOK, it's all there, how to manage a budget, but it's not stressed on the exam because project managers don't normally do that. You normally have accountants that do that for you. Well, that's how this was treated in the past. Not anymore. Now it's actually being brought in, right? And inform the stakeholders of the approved project charter. Once the charter is drafted, we need to make sure everybody understands it, understands what their key deliverables are, their milestones, and their roles and responsibilities. Getting all of this understood before we get underway with the project. We don't want to waste time with planning if we have a misunderstanding at the very beginning, right? So these three tasks, task 2, 7, and 8, those are new, right? Now, 7 and 8 are completely new, but task 2, it is kind of replacing what we had back here. When we take a look at what we had tasks 1 through 6, and you'll see like define high-level scope of the project based on business compliance, right? So that high-level scope. And if we look here, that one's gone, all right? Replaced with identify key deliverables based on blah, 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 right? We're not building the scope anymore. That's kind of what the sponsor is doing when they create that project charter. We're influencing that. So this one has been replaced by our new one where we participate in the development of the scope. So be aware of that. Be aware of these subtle changes that have happened. It's not a significant change. In most cases, it's not even something we have to worry about. Like I have this example here. Perform key stakeholder analysis using various techniques, right? Well, now it reads perform stakeholder analysis. They just dropped the word key. All right, so instead of looking for your key stakeholders, now you're looking at all the stakeholders. Is that a big deal? Do we need to study extra for that? No, not really, right? And that's how most of these changes are. That's why we don't need to panic over the exam update. It is pretty straightforward. All right, now initiating is one example where we just added 3 new processes. Some of the others are a little more significant though. If we take a look at planning, for example, here we've got a new task that's been brought in, which is develop a scope management plan. All right, now if you read the PMBOK, there's a process for creating your scope management plan and your whole project management plan too. That's not new, that's been there a long time. It's just now being called out in the exam objectives. You need to be aware of that. And if you've read most books that are based on the PMBOK 5th edition, or if you've watched our shows at IT Pro TV, we've already covered that, and that's why we don't need to panic about the exam change. All right, some of the other things that have changed, you'll see this guy right here. Develop the stakeholder management plan by analyzing needs and so on. Since we're not just focused on key stakeholders anymore, we need to be focused on all of the stakeholders and how we communicate with them. And that's something we talk about in our communications plan episode, because you've got to figure out how to talk to the stakeholders. Your key stakeholders you might have in-person meetings with every day or every week, but your secondary stakeholders, people who aren't key, them you might just send an email to, right? Email announcement. These might be your customer base. It might be millions of people. You just send an email announcement or you post to a blog. That's how you communicate with them. So we've got to make sure that we've got that management plan for how we make somebody key or move them out from being key, how we communicate, all of that gets tied into there. All right. You'll also see they added a few things under knowledge and skills. They've added human resource planning, lean and efficiency principles, regulatory and environmental impacts and assessment planning, right? These are a couple of extra topics they've added. And this is one of the few things that has kind of changed, because when you talk about human resource planning, all right, we had that. That's been in the PMBOK. That's not new, right? So we've had that inside of our planning and our executing, and a little bit monitoring and controlling too. But that one's been around. But lean and efficiency principles, we didn't really talk about those in the past, right? And if you break open the PMBOK and you start reading through it, they don't really talk about it there either. So they've actually added a knowledge and skill that they expect you to have. And this is where we've had to do a little bit of an update. And I know different vendors are handling it different ways. So if you're dealing with a book that you're reading, they may be putting out a new edition of the book, or they may just do an errata on the website, because it is kind of a small thing. For us at IT Pro TV, we just recorded an extra episode to cover that. So we talked about process analysis and how you can do Lean, Six Sigma, and what else? Kanban, yep. So you got a chance to see those and just kind of update your skills there. The odds are it would be a maximum of like 1 question on the exam, so it's not terribly significant, but you want to make sure that you're prepared for that. So we have to kind of keep an eye out for those little things. And under regulatory and environmental impacts, we're talking about things like standards and guidelines that we have to follow, as well as government rules and regulations. So that's another one to be aware of. All right, other things that have changed under executing, they've added a few new tasks here. Manage the flow of information by using your communications plan. Again, part of the PMBOK already, just being stressed here, which means you're going to start having exam questions on it. In the past, you wouldn't have a lot of exam questions that were based on it, maybe one or two. Now, executing counts for 31% of the exam, and this is one of, what is it, one of 7 different tasks. How many questions is that going to equate to, right? 30% of a 200 question exam, you're talking about 60 questions. That means if there's 7 tasks here, you could have 9 questions based just on managing the flow of information, right? So it's a stressed topic, one that you basically need to make sure that you're aware of and that you know. And maintaining your stakeholder relationships by following that stakeholder management plan. Again, we've already talked about the processes. You guys are already familiar with the processes that are associated with that. It's just there's going to be more questions on it. All right, now one that saw a good bit of change is monitoring and controlling. So monitoring and controlling had 7 tasks before, or had 6 tasks before, I believe. Let's jump back to the old one here. So if I jump over to monitoring and controlling, here we go. So it had 6 before. They took the last one here, communicate project status to the stakeholders, and just dropped that one, right? So that one's gone, and it's been replaced with capture, analyze, and manage your lessons learned. This is something new that the PMI is starting to stress. What we used to do was in the closing of each phase and at the closing of the project as a whole, we'd gather our lessons learned. And our lessons learned would then benefit the next project that happened, right? But the lessons that we were learning right then weren't necessarily benefiting us. And if there was a second project that was going on at the same time, the lessons learned they generated weren't benefiting us. Now what the PMI is stressing is you should always be capturing and managing your lessons learned. And you should be sharing that with other projects immediately. Don't wait until your project's done to share it immediately. And so that's why they're saying capture, you should be gathering your own lessons learned as you go, right? Analyze, you should be breaking them down, building reports, finding out why things happen a certain way, and then managing them, sharing them with the other projects, gathering the lessons learned from them so that you can learn from their lessons faster and you don't potentially have 2 projects making the same mistake at the same time that they could have shared information and avoided that, right? So that's a new stress that they're making here, and it's one that people are already doing out there in the field. The PMI is just adjusting their topics to make sure they reflect that. All right, monitoring procurement activities, right, and following our procurement plan. Remember, procurements, those are contracts that we enter into and purchases that we make. How do we make sure that we're following the guidelines of those contracts? Now, that was something new that was added in the PMBOK 5th edition. So as long as you're studying 5th edition materials, you're fine. That hasn't changed here, right? So they added it, they just didn't stress it on the exam. Now they're stressing it on the exam, so we need to make sure we know that. All right, and here's where you start to see where they've added things. They're actually specifically calling out under knowledge and skills, Lean, Kanban, Six Sigma. They're calling out organizations like the ISO, the BS, CMMI, IEEE. They're calling out these guys because these are the ones that people are using in real life. You need to be familiar with them. And again, we recorded a little extra content for our show to make up the difference. For any of these that we didn't specifically call out before, we now have. So that's wrapped up in our show. And then after that, closing didn't change. Remember that closing, they reduced it from 8% to 7% of the exam, and it stayed the same. No changes there. All right. So as a whole, the changes that we're looking at are really not all that significant. So when this change rolls out, January 11th, 2016, for most of us, if you're studying, if you're watching the shows, if you're reading a book, you really don't need to change anything. It's just the way the questions are weighted, the way the questions are balanced on the exam. It can be a little bit different, and you're good to go. It's not one of those big ones that you panic on. Now, if PMBOK 6th edition was coming out, it'd be a different story, right? Now we might have all new processes, all new tools and techniques to learn. There might be other ones that have gone away we don't need to worry about. There might be some new earned value formulas that we need to worry about, but that's not what's happening here, right? So when you have a RDS, a role delineation survey, it results in minor tweaks to the exam like this that are just not really a panic point.
So Don, if I'm in the middle of studying for this exam and it's right around the corner, 3-4 months away, I don't really have to worry about changing anything in the path that I'm studying. I should be fine as we continue to go up. It doesn't look like it actually just changed, but 2 different percentages, I think we'd be fine, right?
Yeah, and it does come down to the materials you're using. So if you're using IT Pro TV's materials, we based ours on the PMBOK itself, and the PMBOK hasn't changed, so we covered all of it. It's fine. We did have to add one more show. If you're just catching up on this, look for a show. It's part of the part of the executing, right? It's the episode's called Process Analysis. And if you go and look for the episode called Process Analysis, that's where we added a little bit on Six Sigma, a little bit on Lean, a little bit on Kanban, ISO, I think it's a 2-parter, right? So ISO, CMMI, those guys. If you've never heard those acronyms, we covered in that episode, right? Or those 2 episodes. But all the rest of the material is the same. You don't have to panic. Now, if you're reading a book, and the book is not based on the PMBOK, but is instead based directly on the exam objectives, those have changed. And there might be gaps. Any of those things that were highlighted in green when I was showing you the exam objectives, those are things that those books might be missing. And so that's where you have to worry about it. So it really boils down to what your information was based on. And if it was based on the PMBOK, don't panic. Keep studying the way you're studying. You'll be fine. You'll do great on the exam.
Another thing I think we can reassure our viewers of is that here at IT Pro TV, if it does change significantly more, we'll do what? We'll just record more episodes.
Yeah, and we've kind of been planning on that as the PMBOK 6th edition starts to materialize. You know, PMI is really open about it, and you can kind of keep up with the changes they're recommending and all. And we'll probably end up just reshooting the whole series, though, to update it when that happens. But like I said, that'll probably be 2017, or at a minimum, the end of 2016. So it's still a little early for that to happen, but we'll see it down the road.
All right, so that's a great place for us to actually think about that, hey, if I'm ready for the current edition of it, that 2016 objective, I don't need to panic. I just can continue on my path as long as I've got good study materials ahead of me. I'm really set for what we have ahead of us as well. So, signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Ronnie Wong.
And I'm Don Pezet.
And we'll see you next time.